I'm assuming that we ended on the sentence at the top of page 86 that ends, an awareness which the slightest spot of rot symbolized by the taking by a Nazi of a single Jewish cigarette or coin can raise into awareness. I'm assuming that's where we ended. So if we didn't end there, we got to re-edit this piece, okay? So I'm beginning on the first full paragraph on page 86. Here we come to a key point. In the case of both the white racist and the Nazi, the virulence of racist hatred and obsessional thought appears to result from the level of intensity of the threat to the imaginary unity, to our people, whether articulated as the German people, the Aryan race, or the white race. And if we focus on the example of the Nazis, it was in fact the case that the formation of the Nazi Party, the rise of Hitler, and the hyper-cathexis, or investment in, energetic investment in, inflated balloon patriotism that was Nazism, emerged from the humiliation of the German people following World War I, resulting from multiple factors, including the Versailles Treaty and its supposed humiliating treatment of the defeated Germans, but also including the Russian Revolution and the rise of the Communist Party in Germany, which threatened to fracture German unity with its vision of class conflict, and including also the deflated balloon patriotism of the Weimar Republic, with its lack of strong national vision and leadership, and its supposedly decadent and narcissistic cabaret culture. As Hermann Goering himself said at his own trial at Nuremberg after the war, the virulence of Nazism was necessary to reverse this humiliation of the German people and restore German pride. However, we can now see that while this kind of description is accurate enough from a historical and sociological standpoint, from an ontological standpoint, that is going to the heart of being, the being of the Germans at this time, their grounded presence. From an ontological standpoint, the true threat of humiliation is not to the German people, which is in any case an imaginary and substitutive entity, but rather to the vulnerable, withdrawn selves, which are in a state of mutual fear and separation, and which create what we might call the nationalist bubble around themselves in the first place. The threat posed by the Jews or the blacks is not actually to the Germans or the whites, respectively, but to the universal and fragile souls who are concealing themselves and sealing themselves off in these artificial unities in the first place. So, if I'm attached to being one of the German people, like one of the American people, if I'm hyper attached to that outer identity, it's because I'm not feeling your presence right now. You, the person next to me. You, my friend, my lover, my community. I'm not experiencing that as a true ground of I and thou relatedness, where we really do see each other supplely in each other's presence. But instead, because I'm fearful of that degree of vulnerability and presence, I kind of astral project myself into an imaginary unity that compensates for that inner fear, that inner vulnerability, and that lack and withdrawnness and isolation. It compensates for it. And therefore, when that outer unity is humiliated, as in the German people feeling humiliated by the Versailles Treaty at the end of World War I, that threatens to break through the defense mechanism that is protecting people against their true inner longing. And so they tend to puff it up, to defend it, to double, triple their belief in an identification with the outer unity that is protecting them and providing them with a substitute sense of community. And of course that's always accompanied by an intensification simultaneously of rage at the other who is threatening that outer unity. The Jews, the blacks, the projected demonized group that is threatening the puffed up outer unity of the group I identify with, I project myself out into in the imaginary. Seen in its true ontological dimension, nationalist identifications can therefore normally exist in what we might call non-virulent form, so long as the nation-state is stable, along with the alienated relations that produce and for the most part require a collective belief in the shared imaginary unity. But when upheavals occur that threaten that shared experience of withness, as was the case with Germany after World War I, the virulence of the identification and the projected threat inevitably intensifies, because the vulnerability of the withdrawn self to being seen in all its vulnerability, in all its true longing for authentic mutual recognition by and with the other, is proportionally heightened at the same time. What the
Sorry, it's fine. I just heard that bang.
Yeah. What the Nazi really fears, in other words, is that he will be revealed as the vulnerable child that he actually is, innocently seeking the love of the other, and that he will be utterly repudiated, rejected, and despised for having revealed that very longing, that beautiful longing that all we humans share. That's the true fear, to be revealed as vulnerable to you and in need of your love. Not the German people are threatened or humiliated, which is a substitute identification that is playing the role of protecting me against revealing the true presence that I am to you, that might not be affirmed by you if I reveal it. I made this point earlier when I was talking about America, but this always comes to my mind when I see the t-shirt or the sign, "These colors don't bleed," with the flag, because "these colors don't bleed" is the tough expectation of bleeding that is then defeated by the tough attitude of protecting the American self, symbolized in that image of the flag, of protecting that against anyone who threatens it. But that's a tough stance, but underlying that is the vulnerable being of the person who, if she or he could let down the whole tough, I'm an American flag and these colors don't bleed, they'd want to take off the t-shirt. because the t-shirt is an imaginary substitute for true reciprocity, true relatedness between vulnerable humans to each other in a spiritually grounded, loving togetherness. When you can experience that, you don't want to wear things like that. Tough things. Thus, neither the Germans nor the Jews, neither the whites nor the blacks, should ever be mistaken for real entities within the idealization, demonization matrix. In every case, they are internalized and projected artificial unities that are imposed on actual human beings who are in truth simply universal presences seeking the recognition of the other and the realization of a social universe based on loving reciprocity. Of course, terrible evil can be committed in the service of denying this truth, as the Holocaust and slavery show. But we must always resist the impulse to ourselves dehumanize those who carry this evil out. Instead, we must recover the distortions in their experience from the inside through intuition and empathy, and we must invent psycho-spiritual modes of public intervention that actually address the pathological and pathogenic alienation within which these social actors are immersed. Thus, it is not sufficient, if we actually wish to end racism, to make discrimination illegal, or even fight against discrimination in all its forms. Because for the racist, too much is at stake to give up discrimination. In the case of the white working-class member of the Ku Klux Klan, materially impoverished and demeaned all his life as less than in the wider culture, cut off from any social force that would recognize him and hold him in natural esteem for his true self. His whiteness is, from the point of view of his lived experience, indispensable to his very existence. If we understand that he gains his sense of withness through co-creating that whiteness as substitute community, we can see that from his point of view, he cannot give up demonizing the threats to it, on which his identity itself depends, unless a real we offers him a way out. For example, a restorative justice circle in which he experiences himself recognized as fully human and worthy of love and affirmation and respect. Or less ambitiously, a wider social movement that invites him to become part of a universal idealistic world, grounded in empathy and mutuality, with meaningful work, universal health care, social security, family support, opportunities for communitarian participation in co-creating the social world. While those attracted to the most pathological and virulent forms of artificial group unity are likely to be among the last to be reached by a psycho-spiritual movement with these elements, because they are the most defended against letting down the defenses they exist inside of. It remains possible that some of them would be so reached, and more important, it is likely that many fewer people would be drawn to a pathological world like that of the Nazis or the Klan if such a movement were to radiate its presence across the wider culture. So, what has to be addressed is the underlying reason that people become hyper-identified with their whiteness, with their imaginary unities, their imaginary sense of connection to others. That underlying worthlessness, that underlying lack of recognition, that underlying vulnerability that is covering itself up because it's never been recognized and affirmed, is going to keep creating the imaginary unity at all costs, because that is the basis of what connection there is for people. They don't want their whiteness taken away. That's all they have as a substitute defensive formation protecting them. And to have whiteness, to have their whiteness, because they know it's a false identity, because it's just on the outer self, it's not grounded, because it's got that hole in it, whiteness, it's nothing, because they know it's nothing, unconsciously. They constantly have to defend it against projected, demonized others who are not white, who are black, who are another color, a non-white color. So to say you shouldn't discriminate against blacks, it's important to do that as part of the raising of social consciousness, but the essential long-term task is to heal the underlying reason that people develop white supremacist fantasies in the first place, as a substitution for their own internal lack of ground, lack of love, lack of ability to reveal themselves in their true longing. And that requires offering them participation in something real, in something healing that truly sees them. And when we create a movement that does manifest that mutuality and care and love for others, when we create a movement that manifests that, although of course there's tremendous resistance to receiving it because it's a carrier of vulnerability, of opening up, and it calls on people to open up. When we create a movement like that, it's not that it will reach people who are the most hardened in these racist fantasies right away. As I say, they're very far down the list in terms of likelihood of being reached in the short run. But people who are not drawn into the core are more likely to come and join us if they see an alternative path to the path of the Confederacy, the South, Dixie, the white race. Of course, not to say that everybody in the South, or even who identifies with the Confederacy, fits the racist stereotype. I think maybe we should edit that out.
That's fine. Mm-hmm.
Just the South.
Yeah,
stuff.
I copy. No
So
problem.
It starts pushing
I got you.
buttons.
I got you.
Okay, nationalism as an expression of authentic community.
Well, just to your point, like the Texas, like I'm always pushing back on people where I'm like, dude, Texas is like California. It's just people can't get out of there. You know, like,
Yeah.
You know what I mean? You go to Houston, it's just, you're in Los Angeles.
Well, also people do identify with Southern culture and
Yeah,
heritage. And
yeah.
Many people, they won't
It's
admit it,
beautiful.
but that's the Confederacy is part of that. As my friend Gary Peller from Georgia says, that's why people were into paddling their children, because that was all part of the sensual community of the South, although it was fucked up. Okay,
Right.
But it wasn't terrible.
It was a thing. It was its own thing. No, I hear you. But we'll take that. We'll keep that on the cutting floor.
Okay. Nationalism as an expression of authentic community. For all that I have said here about the pathological aspect of the imaginary community as an aspect of social alienation, we must always recall that the description remains partial, because at every moment social reality is co-constituted by, or co-determined by, the transcendent desire for mutual recognition, coexisting in everyone with the fear of that very impulse. To the degree that we are trapped in the spiritual prison of reciprocally enforced isolation, to the extent that we are enveloped by a social milieu in which the rotation of otherness leads to the collective withdrawal of our true mutuality of presence, To that extent, all of the pathological features of imaginary group unities are dominant in the culture. In today's United States, for example, conservatives have been able to sustain their large following for almost 40 years, since the first election of Ronald Reagan, by appealing to an idealized image of God, America, and the family, imagos of imaginary unity which are represented as always being under threat from an enemy. Today, Iran and Russia. When I wrote this a few years ago, it was Iran and Russia. Then Iran kind of went out of vogue. Now it's back. So as of today, when I'm reading this, Iran and Russia are once again playing the role of the enemy. So the conservatives have appealed to an idealized image of God, America, and the family, imagos of imaginary unity which are represented as always being under threat from an enemy. Today, Iran and Russia, among others. 30 years ago, the liberals and the ACLU. Just a reminder for people who weren't aware of this, that when in 1988, when George Bush Sr. ran against Michael Dukakis, who was the Democratic candidate, he attacked him publicly for being a card-carrying member of the ACLU. And at that time, the ACLU was a repository of those others that are trying to threaten our idealized America. By continually invoking both the idealization of these images of community and the battle against the threats to the perfection of these images, conservatives have spoken to the longing for mutual recognition immanent within a dispersed and isolated people, and offered an imaginary form of it which serves both to provide a substitute sense of community and to prevent such an authentic community from actually coming into existence. So it's a paradox. The appeal always to a more and more perfect, greater and greater America, both provides a substitute sense of community for a dispersed and isolated group of people, and protects against the longing for the authentic community that people do not believe is possible, each from their own isolated vantage point. But whenever social movements are able to arise in which authentic mutual recognition does become possible, religion, nationalism, and other manifestations of the new group in emergence acquire a real basis. Whatever the historical and social causes that precondition the emergence of such liberatory movements, the movement itself always emerges in a ricochet of recognition across social space. In fact, the very ricochet is what actually moves in a movement, a turning of social being itself outward from its withdrawn and trapped location and into a growingly radiant and new ground of common existence. At such moments, the pre-existing conditioned forms of identity may undergo a reversal of meaning. As when Fidel Castro and his fellow rebels, for example, could reclaim Cuba as an evocation of national community from the dictator Fulgencio Batista. In a period of just a year, both Castro and Batista held the title President of Cuba. But the meaning of that phrase underwent a kind of ontological reversal during the revolutionary transition. In Batista's regime, the title signified an imaginary ordering with the president on top of a passive dispersal of withdrawn selves contained within an imaginary hierarchy and falsely unified in an image of a nation. as the revolutionary movement overwhelmed that prior scattering of reciprocal solitudes. In the ricochet into existence of the emergent revolutionary group, the idea of Cuba became a real expression of the new authentic community, and Castro's title became a true incarnation of his leadership of and symbolic embodiment of the new group in emergence. It is the base of real social relations, in other words, that determines the degree of authenticity of the way the social relations are represented in reflective discourse. And of course, this redemptive capacity exists not only for names and titles, but other symbols of the group's authentic or imaginary unity as well. A flag may be a symbolic object that isolated people stand around to pledge their allegiance to in the service of the denial of their actual desire for true contact. Or it may be, in transformative historical moments, a mediation in a symbolic object of an emerging authentic community of mutual presence, sometimes among millions of people. Even in periods in which alienation outweighs authenticity in the rotations of cultural life, symbols of national unity are never wholly vehicles for the imaginary. Let me reread that. Do that one over again. Mm-hmm. Even in periods in which alienation outweighs authenticity in the rotations of cultural life, symbols of national unity are never wholly vehicles for the imaginary and reinforcements of the false group. To refer again to the United States today, there remains an authentic impulse to some aspects of patriotism that is carried forward from generative historical moments when these cultural manifestations expressed an authentic meaning emanating from their genuinely connected social base. For example, the moral conviction that we quietly feel in supporting the progressive liberatory meanings of freedom of speech or civil rights or other forms of social progress that emerged from their respective historical movements, or other positive aspects of the culture that in their generative origins provided channels for our authentic communitarian impulses, like rock and roll. All these aspects of our collective life can retain their link to the creation of a world that would actually realize our desire for mutual recognition. At the same time that these very same aspects of our cultural life can be intended to and actually do serve to reinforce our separation, as when freedom of speech is used to rationalize unlimited corporate campaign contributions, or civil rights are used to defend merely equality of opportunity to compete in the marketplace, or rock and roll music becomes a co-opted and anti-spiritual rhythmic distraction from psycho-spiritual pain. So there's good rock and roll and bad rock and roll. There's good freedom of speech and bad freedom of speech. And to the extent that we, in our being, feeling American, to the extent that it's associated with good freedom of speech or good rock and roll, with, in other words, the historical memory when those had meanings that connected us in a truly idealistic way, a way in which we were creating a good community together through them. Well, those a very small p, patriotism. In other words, an aspect of our Americanness that is worthy, that is part of the effort to create an authentic human community. But it coexists with the fear-saturated those same things can mean the opposite of that when they are invoked to give legitimacy to our alienation and separation. There's nothing that gives you the feeling of openness to truly express your mind to each other. That aspect of freedom of speech. A culture in which we can truly speak from our hearts to each other about what we really think and believe. Of course, that's a necessary aspect of a good world, such a thing. But there's nothing like that in tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of dollars being spent by corporations to manipulate people through television advertising into voting for the candidates they want in elections. But freedom of speech as a concept is associated with both of those meanings. So the point is, as in the case of Castro's Cuba versus Batista's Cuba, the word Cuba, that sound, and what it signifies in terms of the meaning of the group life, of a real group, is completely different. In the case of Castro coming down from the hills and rising to unite the poor Cuban people in the creation of a new country, a revolutionary country, and what it meant for Batista, who had a cruel dictatorship that he presided over at the top of as the president of Cuba. Is that clear enough?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So you can take out that. Is that clear enough?
No, absolutely.
Okay. We must always remember that the coexistence of desire for authentic connection with the other and the fear of the other one more time on that sentence.
Yeah, and then just if I could say, in a sense, it's like a discussion I have with my brother a lot, is the flag is a symbol of bad patriotism, but also it's like to see it as a symbol of a real community is not necessarily a wrong interpretation.
Yes, that's
that
right.
It's like people have fought the good fight with the flag too.
Yeah.
Unions and so forth.
Right,
and
exactly. We must always remember that the coexistence of desire for authentic connection with the other and the fear of the other coexist across the culture. Each gains ascendancy at different moments in the spiral of our real, as opposed to our imaginary, collective history. And this very doubleness of our social reality means that reflective identifications like America are never carriers of a singular, negative, or alienated meaning. Our analysis of the effects of alienation must always be leavened by our awareness of the boxed-in social longing, that permanent potentiality of hope that seeks at every moment to transcend our alienation, and that has transcended our alienation in those historical desire-realizing movements of the past which are never wholly repressed in the present. So we carry with us the struggles of the abolitionists to eliminate slavery, the struggles of unions for equality, for a true meaning of equality, and for freedom of speech, since they were a critical group that brought true freedom of speech into the meaning of our American heritage and of what people legitimately take pleasure in and identify with as a collective memory. And these elements coexist with the false elements that actually prevent us from bringing a world into existence that would realize a collectivity where authentic freedom of speech and truly equal human relations that embody mutual recognition can come into existence. Okay, that's the end of chapter 4.
Great job.